You're listening to the European Parliamentary Research Service podcast on Ukraine.
What started as a pro-European revolution in downtown Kiev has escalated into a full-blown international crisis, putting the European Union and the US at odds with Russia.
And despite the guns having largely fallen silent for extended periods, the conflict is nowhere near over. Stay with us for a recount of the origins and evolution of a conflict that has shaken the foundations of Europe's security architecture.
Time has passed, but how can we forget the images of Ukrainian men and women defying the cold and the fear, waving European flags at Maidan Square, and the brutal repression that followed?
Hard images, but also hard figures. According to the UN, more than 9,000 people have been killed, some 21,000 wounded, and more than 1 million displaced since the crisis erupted in March 2014.
Today, more than 2 years after Euromaidan revolution, Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea and the eruption of the conflict in eastern Ukraine, the country is still at a crossroads between war and peace, between corruption and reform.
Moreover, the international efforts to find a solution and the repeated calls by the European Parliament to implement the Minsk agreement seem to have fallen on deaf ears. So how did we reach this point? Recounting the conflict's beginnings may offer some clues.
It was in November 2013, on the occasion of the Eastern Partnership Summit in Vilnius, when Ukraine's former President Viktor Yanukovych declined to sign an association agreement with the EU, cashing in on a $15 billion loan from Moscow and a lucrative gas deal instead.
It would not take long before pro-European large-scale protests at Maidan Square mushroomed all over the country, forcing an impeachment vote by the Ukrainian parliament on President Yanukovych, who ended up fleeing from Kiev.
Moscow's response to this perceived coup d'etat took the international community by surprise. In a move to avoid Ukraine escaping Russia's sphere of influence, President Putin mobilized his troops to annex the Crimean peninsula and launched an undeclared hybrid war against Ukraine, tightening the economic grip in Ukraine and putting the Kremlin's propaganda machine into full gear.
So how did the European Union and the international community respond to such provocation and clear breaches of international law?
Well, with a mix of hard and soft power, the EU's High Representative Federica Mogherini and especially the European Parliament have continually deplored the illegal annexation of Crimea and Russia's hybrid war against Ukraine.
In early 2016, MEPs urged the EU to support Ukraine in current and future disputes with Russia and condemned the unprecedented levels of human rights abuses against Crimean Tatars.
On the diplomatic side, the EU also cancelled the EU-Russia summit, which was scheduled for June 2014, and the G8 meeting due to take place in the same month in Sochi was moved to Brussels in a G7 format without Russia. Furthermore, all future bilateral EU-Russia meetings were suspended, as well as visa talks.
And that's not all. Asset freezes and visa bans have been imposed on 146 people and 37 entities for their deliberate actions to destabilise Ukraine. The EU has also banned goods coming from Crimea or Sevastopol unless they have Ukrainian certificates, and has blocked investment in tourism in those territories.
But possibly the most effective and pain-inflicting measures adopted by the EU are the economic sanctions targeting trade exchanges with Russia. Some estimates put the Russian economic loss at €100 billion, but Russian countermeasures have also taken their toll on European farmers, which have seen some of their products banned from the Russian market.
EU member states have extended the sanctions until July 2016. But what about the political efforts to find a solution and avoid the conflict in Ukraine turning into a frozen conflict? Let's take a look at that.
In September 2014, 6 months after Russia's annexation of Crimea, a peace plan for eastern Ukraine prepared by representatives from Ukraine, Russia and the OSCE was signed in the Belarusian capital, Minsk.
The plan called for an immediate ceasefire, but continuous violations forced the talks to continue, and a follow-up to the protocol clarifying the steps to its implementation was agreed in September 2014. Despite the efforts of the international community, the fighting continued, and by January 2015, the Minsk Protocol ceasefire had completely collapsed.
A month later, the leaders of France, Germany, Ukraine and Russia had agreed to a new ceasefire, the so-called Minsk II agreement. This called for an immediate end of hostilities and the withdrawal of all heavy weapons by both sides under the watchful eye of an OSCE-led monitoring regime.
Minsk II also called for the release of all hostages and illegally detained persons, for safe conditions to deliver humanitarian aid, and for local elections in the Donetsk and Luhansk regions to be held according to OSCE standards. So was Minsk II more successful than Minsk I?
Well, even if the EU sees it as the foundation of a lasting solution to the conflict, the truth is that progress in the implementation of all these points has been very, very limited. And despite the fact that the number of casualties in hotspots has gone down, the threat of escalation remains. So in March 2016, the President of the European Parliament, Martin Schulz, and Ukrainian President Petro Poroshenko agreed on the need to relaunch the Minsk process and its full implementation.
A further factor fueling tensions between Russia and Ukraine is the case of the Ukrainian military pilot Nadia Savchenko, who was abducted from Ukraine and held in Moscow on charges of involvement in the death of 2 Russian journalists in eastern Ukraine in 2014. A Russian court on the 22nd of March 2016 found Savchenko guilty on all counts and sentenced her to 22 years in a penal colony. Ukrainian President Poroshenko urged Russian President Vladimir Putin to return Savchenko in a prisoner exchange.
Savchenko's illegal detention has become a symbol of Ukraine's conflict with Russia, and her case has been closely monitored by the European Parliament. European Parliament President Martin Schulz has expressed concern about her treatment and health conditions while awaiting a trial, which has sparked strong international criticism for being politicised and not meeting international standards. President Schulz expressed dismay at the sentence, calling on Putin to use his constitutional powers to pardon her.
57 MEPs from 5 of the biggest political groups in the European Parliament co-signed a letter to the High Representative Federica Mogherini calling on the EU to adopt sanctions against Russian officials involved in her kidnapping, unlawful detention and imprisonment.
Her case illustrates the lack of progress on one of the key points of Minsk II, the release of all hostages and illegally detained persons, but progress on another key political point, the organisation of free and fair elections in the Donetsk and Luhansk regions, is also stalled.
So against this background of political instability, can Ukraine continue to make steps towards the European Union? Stay with us.
Well, the conflict has certainly not killed Ukraine's European aspirations. In fact, in this time, the country has taken significant steps towards European integration.
The EU-Ukraine Deep and Comprehensive Free Trade Area Agreement was signed in June 2014 as part of the Association Agreement between the EU and Ukraine. And despite the challenges posed by the 6th of April Dutch referendum on the agreement, the process has set sail.
However, there is still a lot of work to do. The country is in a frail economic state and relies heavily on external credit. This is not so much the consequence of war, but rather the result of years of mismanagement and endemic corruption. However, the reforms undertaken so far by the Ukrainian government have earned EU recognition.
They have indeed. Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker announced that the EU will formally launch the process for approving Ukraine's visa-free access to the EU in April. And on the European Parliament side, President Schulz agreed with President Poroshenko on the need to urgently solve the current governmental crisis and continue the reform agenda. He encouraged all political forces in Ukraine to unite in their support for a stable government and focus on the implementation of structural reforms and on the association agreement.
The EU has made it clear that Ukraine is a priority country within the European Neighbourhood Policy and the Eastern Partnership, and it has committed €11 billion to support the reform process currently underway.
And on the 16th of March, the Commission stepped up its humanitarian response with an extra €20 million to help people affected by the conflict in eastern Ukraine. But perhaps even more important than financial support is the strong political support Ukraine is receiving from the European Parliament.
The simultaneous ratification of the Association Agreement by the Ukrainian Parliament and the European Parliament on the 16th of September 2014 was a highly symbolic act and a sign of solidarity with Ukraine, but cooperation between the two institutions goes much deeper.
Aware that democracy, economic and social stability is built on strong and independent institutions, a needs assessment mission led by Pat Cox visited Ukraine 6 times between September 2015 and February 2016, evaluating the areas in which to strengthen the Ukrainian parliament as an effective democratic institution.
Their conclusions were presented during the Ukraine Week in Brussels in early March 2016, an event which brought more than 40 Ukrainian parliamentarians together with MEPs, national MPs and representatives from other EU institutions to share experience on good parliamentary practice, lawmaking and representation. The next step will be the implementation of the report's recommendations, which is currently being planned.
In more than 2 years of conflict in Ukraine, the European Parliament has been an unfailing voice in support of Ukraine. It has passed resolutions deploring the illegal annexation of Crimea and Russia's hybrid war against Ukraine.
It has repeatedly called for an immediate ceasefire and for Russia to end all involvement in the conflict and allow international monitoring of the Russian-Ukrainian border. It has also demanded the immediate release of Nadia Savchenko. All eyes are now in Russia. Will Moscow start to take Minsk seriously? From the European Parliament, we'll be listening and watching.
You're listening to the European Parliamentary Research Service podcasts.